Is it just me, or is Aston Martin treating Adrian Newey like the Messiah or something? Because for a man known to be painfully modest, what we've seen from his team is the complete opposite. The car that we all gawped at around Barcelona? Well, that may have not been even their final form. Aston have done something F1 teams usually try to avoid. They preemptively framed the first public running as not the real picture, and they did it in plain sight on their own terms on their own website with Newey as the main voice. The message basically reading, "Don't judge what you saw in Barcelona." And at the same time, they're making the designer the headline act of the project. I'm not saying this is Adrian's team wholesale, but given the current climate at the moment, it's probably quite savvy for Papa Stroll to allow Newey to run the show and take all of the glory. In his latest piece for Aston's website, Adrian says the Melbourne car will be very different to the Barcelona shakedown car. A harmless-looking sentence that quietly grants the team a lot of freedom when you think about it. And yes, I know my take last week didn't age well. I said it wasn't the ideal start, and then they went on to recover with 60 plus laps on Friday. It wasn't the over 100 laps that I was expecting, and said in that video if they wished to try and escape all of the, speculation, but it was certainly enough to move the story on that little bit in a positive direction. And with them saying the car that we'll see at round 1 of the 2026 season being very different, it makes the Barcelona car emotionally disposable. Oh, it only did a few laps on its debut on day 4? Pfft, whatever, we're not going to race with it anyway. And then all of the photos that we saw, the photos that all of the experts just completely lost their trousers with, are now just rough drafts. They are not the definitive article. We have no idea where that design is within the process or whether it's the full picture. And yet it allowed Aston Martin fans to start believing and thinking the way Ferrari fans tend to do every single year, that this year is our year. Building mythology before there is concrete evidence as to whether or not the AMR26 is the real deal. But let's all remember, and I have to remind myself sometimes, it's just testing, bro. Which is exactly what you can tell everyone else with this shirt on my store, available through February 20, and then it's gone. Because after that, it's just not testing anymore. Makes sense, right? But anyway, that sentence also creates a second launch. Not a launch event in the traditional sense, but a moment. So you can forget February the 9th, all we'll get is the livery. We'll get the real car being visible either in the second test around Bahrain or around Melbourne. When the car went out around the Circuit de Catalunya, that was the moment that it proved that the car could run at all. That's a little strange because typically, F1 teams tend to really lean on plausible deniability when they can be quite coy or uncertain about their prospects, as in going, well, we're not sure, really. It's a favourite angle to go with. And it's an angle that Mercedes is trying and failing to employ themselves. Yes, we do get some sandbagging, but amidst all of that sandbagging, you do get some very chirpy optimism along for the ride, including some very aggressive takes, which is what Toto Wolff was doing on Monday, as I said in my video from yesterday. Then with really wide grins after years of toiling around with ground effect, which Adrien Newey himself was not a real big fan of, as I'll talk about later. Aston, in contrast, is making a promise through visible change, as in saying, yeah, the car that we showed you, it's not the real version, so, watch this space. But why? Why are they doing this? Well, I mean, for starters, it forces everyone, including the teams, to just ponder around the high-resolution photographs they took to try and understand what the team is doing, and are now thinking, is that even the real thing? Have we been duped here? It certainly didn't help them the fact that Aston weren't really running at full bore down the straights either. But yes, one boring answer I will give you right now is that it might be just down to the timeline, because a shakedown is just that. It's to shake all of the bugs out to make sure you can even run the thing before you can even start to think about chasing performance, which will explain why we saw in some pictures with Stroll the light at the back of the car emitting blue light rather than red light. It's down to an understanding with the FIA that either a complete rookie is driving that hasn't got a super license yet, or they are running the car not at full chat. And to make sure the car can actually function to the best of its ability and make sure it's not an expensive paperweight, which is what the FW48 might have been had James Vowles and their team decided to run the thing in a compromised fashion, which we found out is not going to be the case. Lo and behold, the rumours about this car being overweight were completely unfounded. It being about a tin of chopped tomatoes heavier than the Mercedes W17. And I've said it before and I will say it again, the fact that Aston Martin were able to pull off this kind of chicanery in of itself is something that we should really appreciate. They've come a very long way in the last couple of years to have the resources in which to pull this off at all. Yeah, that's the conventional side of things, but the spicy side of things might be down to the contrast of the first Adrien Newey interview that we saw back in May of last year. Back then, Newey did the classic engineer's thing of refusing to daydream, dragging the conversation down from the clouds and not thinking about the hype. And that's what makes the contrast feel sharp today, because what the team's doing with its presentation is trying to create some sort of mythological beast. Newey, though, in the actual text, trying to make the work the story, but Aston are doing the complete opposite in building a stained glass window behind him in his honour. Because the interview starts before we talk to Adrian talking about fan obsession and flight tracking, it being one of the most tracked flights in the entire world on the 28th of January as the team went out to the shakedown. And as I saw from the Spanish media, they were tracking that plane as well as the DHL lorries that were carrying the car from the airport to the track. It was absolutely bonkers, and the team, clearly aware of all of the hunger and desire for images and secrets of the thing, they were lapping this up and more than happy to indulge. And then we've got the tagline, by design, making Adrien even larger than life than he already is, with the accolade of trophies and honours that he's already managed to accrue. And the image that is presented of Adrien telling you exactly how to feel when you read his words, as in looking to the legend of the man rather than just realising, well, this guy is an engineer and he's trying to tell you all, keep an open mind. It really clashes with the imagery that the website is trying to hurl at you. That in of itself may be by design, and Aston trying to control the narrative and when judgment is perfectly valid as to their car and their team. And I admit, you might be thinking, Law, where is your spanner right here? You should really be carrying this. Well, I really don't feel the need to, because we've seen this quite a lot over the course of January and early February. Audi kicking this all off when their shakedown car, back at the beginning of the month, was leaked by many people, and then hours later, they posted images on their socials, trying to take back control of the narrative. And then the F1 teams lost control of their narrative because F1 needed their content, and then guys up trees took the narrative for themselves, and now the F1 fans have been left, well, we don't know what to believe anymore. Because going into a year of unknowns, trying to have some sort of narrative to really build up might be a competitive tool in of itself, and really bring them a lot of kudos. And in F1, first impressions can be everything. This is exactly what I said last week. The first impressions that we got of that car bugging out after a few laps wasn't great, but they managed to correct themselves, and then right here with this interview just a few days later, we've now moved on. But at the time, we were all fixated with the wild-looking doodads that we could see, and fans plus experts deciding that it's genius. We all got embroiled in the chatter, especially with that weird suspension solution. We're all barking like seals at it and decide, oh yes, it's an absolute Newey signature! And then the rivals stare at the same photos and decide where to point their cameras next. By the time we get to Australia, people will still be talking about that first glimpse and then looking at the car and deciding whether or not it was the truth or not. And even the teams aren't exactly sure, because the team deliberately chose to limit the top speed of their car. Are these parts even any good? We and they don't know. And Aston Martin are deciding to run with that unknown and really milk it for all that it is worth. Them saying that, oh yeah, you can look, but you can't know yet. And that the car might have only just been a prototype that was good enough to run to try and check out the systems under the hood that may have been further along, which is specifically the Honda power unit and how it interacts with the rest of the car, or at least the base product of the car. We'll probably not see anything relevant until round 1 around Albert Park. At the test, we might see a selection of different parts being run at different times. You wouldn't really be able to build a whole picture of the AMR26 as they go out in FP1 or on the media day. And this is really weird, because usually teams don't like to play fast and loose with a concept and change it this visibly if they say it's going to be very different from this test to round 1. That is something that is going to really give the teams the heebie-jeebies as to whether or not Aston Martin may be competitive or not. Unless the early car was not the story. So what could very different mean? Well, the basics would be the bodywork. As I just mentioned, we might see a final configuration of various bits and pieces that are tested and calibrated at different times. And that what we got around Spain might have been the basic bodywork, that we might see things that are even more elaborate, with Adrian being demure and saying, well, The things that we're running might be interpreted as aggressive, but we don't think that. We could easily push that little bit further and then really blow people's socks off. I mean, I'm paraphrasing here, but you get the idea. Because probably the extreme version's still being made back at the factory, or maybe they didn't want to give rivals a clean photo of the real aero intent. Kind of like what Ferrari's current car is doing as well, then reportedly running a simpler version of their final form. And the test itself proved to be more public than teams hoped for, so this strategy, if Adrian is employing it, might actually have been for the best, which is why there are rumours coming out that the first day around Bahrain might be close to the public after all, based on what happened around Barcelona. But what it could also mean is that the more detailed elements that bring the AMR26 together are still in flux, and that Adrian won't have a final car until the very last minute because packaging was this tight, and they prioritised getting the platform running at all. And again, that rear suspension geometry that everyone was talking about because they could see it, might be only one piece of the puzzle. There might be more to it that we simply cannot see. There might be stuff at the front that works with that suspension. There might be things that interacts with the drivability that only the drivers can tell us all. So it's all still a bunch of unknowns with this car. Aston left it late to get the car out there, and it just makes you think, is the timing also a thing by design? Well, again, I do think so. It gives us little time to think, and we're left stewing over this and thinking about this team for days and days on end, building up the hype even more. And leaving many drivers and teams thinking about what just happened, including the likes of George Russell. His take around the Aston visually being the standout, and says everyone was looking at it, is then contrasted with him refusing to crown it as the best out there, saying it's not about being sexy, but about being fast that'll win races and titles. Fair point. We'll find that out around Melbourne. He's telling us all, George, that Aston are playing a longer game and that it would be unwise to judge everything on this test alone, but the masses, the media, the fans, oh, we fell for it hook, line and sinker because it's an Adrien Newey car. This has been talked about ever since he was employed by Aston Martin. It's finally here. Well, it might not be finally here. Yep, we all bit by design. Then Newey drops another second spicy detail about the old ground effect era cars, them being difficult to drive. And he says that Aston were a particular example of that trend. So read that again, folks. He's indirectly admitting that Aston Martin's recent cars were a limiting factor, that they were bad. That is really big considering who he is, the team principal of said team, and it also connects the car concept to the drivers in the most direct possible way. Drivability being the difference between extracting the lap time you paid for and leaving it on the table. And it tying back into what Ayo Komatsu over at Haas was saying regarding what might actually be the great differentiator in terms of lap time. It may not necessarily be the internal combustion engine compression limit of 0.3 of a second per lap, potentially an extra 10 horsepower. It might be down to simply getting your deployment right, and you can easily gain at least half a second per lap because of it. Way more than the ratio of 16:1 or 18:1, or whether or not it's measured in ambient temperatures or not. That might be more important, and just making sure the car is really nice to drive lap after lap. So, making the cars easy to drive or not that difficult to master will be critical for all drivers concerned, especially, you-know-who next to the Spaniard. But at the same time, we might see an Aston Martin which is quick, but it might suffer from the same thing that the Adrien Newey cars over at Red Bull in recent times suffered from too. A narrow operating window. A car which is really on the nose and really is just specific and very, very sniffy when it comes to how it's dialed in. Sure, you can make it quick, but if it's not that flexible, then what good is it? A driver could become, say it with me now, cursed. And we've only got to look at the last couple of Red Bulls that were not under full Adrien Newey control as a prime example of all of this. All ironic, actually, given this was all based off of Newey's RB18, which Max Verstappen had to go and test around Imola around 2024, as a reference to help the brand new team led by Pierre Vacher to understand the issues around curbs and bump riding, given that Newey was no longer present to help the team patch the RB20. Which Max called a particular monster. Then Adrian goes and rubs salt into the wound, saying that maybe a lack of experience contributed to the direction of the car going completely off of his original design, as it became harder to drive. Thusly, and I will get the spanner out here because we simply do not know because we've not got the final car, there might be a situation where Adrian has taken all the stuff on board that he saw with how the RB18, his car, was then evolved, and then thinking, well, okay, if we are going to be having these rules for a while, we better have a car which has a better operating ceiling and can actually be developed that little bit further instead of it peaking far too soon and then it starts to try and eat itself. And they're quite happy to reveal an incomplete version of the AMR26 to allow other systems to be checked and calibrated so they actually run, as well as giving Honda at least a little bit of time to understand the concept and that they at least have a slightly better time than they did at the beginning of 2015. Hey, it was better for Fernando because, well, he actually remembered all of it, unlike that last time when he just forgot where he was. We still really don't know what happened around 2015 Barcelona testing. I don't think even he knows. Yeah, that's a little bit of winter slop we've not really had much of yet. So even though you might be thinking, well, okay, that Barcelona test was mostly pointless, well, not necessarily, because Adrian did then go on to admit that the team was 4 months behind 2026 development during his initial time there. They have, hopefully, in his mind, caught up, but there is still that element to consider. So them getting out there at all means that at least they could have just at least figured out what's going on with correlation with their brand new tunnel sponsored by CoreWeave. Now take all of that and look at the drivers, because it's Aston Martin, we absolutely have to look at the drivers. This is where Aston's by design campaign becomes genuinely dangerous, because myths tend to pick heroes, villains, and supporting characters, and in this particular mythology Aston may be trying to paint, we're all tempted to paint Newey as the architect, Alonso as the warrior, and Stroll as a guy who's just there. Yes, I know, it's so easy to go down the route on hating on Lance Stroll because he's not as good as Fernando, but at this point, we've now had so many years of evidence of those two working together to back it up. Fernando is Lance's longest-serving teammate in Formula 1, so there is plenty of reference material, including the fact of 36-0 in qualifying. 36-0. And also Alonso, the environment that's being crafted around him, the fact that it's being led by a technical genius, the car really rising to the fore with him having years of development behind it. This is the kind of environment with a bunch of super elite engineers. He's going to revel in all of this because he's one of the best drivers out there to find problems in your car and tell you to your face. And believe me, we have plenty of evidence in that regard in how honest and open Alonso has been to his engineers and his team. And also him being able to plonk a middling car up into Q3 when we really think that car does not deserve to be there, as we saw a lot of in 2025. And he's one of the best at turning chaos into performance, but again, it can be a tricky act to just make sure that it doesn't end up in just chaos being developed. So a car that evolves rapidly between the shakedown and the first race, that could be a real playground for him to enjoy. Each new piece being a puzzle, and I think he likes his puzzles. Lance, though, faces a different problem. He needs a stable environment around this car in which to prove doubters wrong, and that he can extract the car's full potential, or as much of it as possible, around Fernando. The moment the team's public story becomes all about Newey's masterpiece coming later, which is exactly what it is right now, every early struggle that Lance faces will be amplified. Every single lap that he turns that is not quite up to snuff with Fernando's will be seen as a headline in of itself, that maybe Lance is way in over his head or something like that, which is sort of what we got when that car bugged out on him after just 4 or 5 laps. And this then leads into our Lord and Saviour Bernie Collins' piece that Lance, might feel hard done by regarding that he didn't get much time and actually got to have a taste of the Aston Martin car in that guise at that stage of its development, whereas Fernando got over 10 times that. But to be fair, she does have some sort of personal bias being former Aston Martin strategist. But according to her, the issue may end up being that in a season where the team are building a near-religious aura, being a driver who didn't get the first full taste can feel like being a step behind in your own garage, which your own father created to boot. It could maybe lead to feeling like you got a tiny chip on your shoulder in terms of ownership of the team. And if after years of advertising from Autoglass taught me anything, a chip can easily turn into a crack. And I'm not talking about Mike Crack, Lance's biggest cheerleader and defender. So okay, I'd like you to imagine the first few races for Aston Martin, the flyaway races. The Australian Grand Prix arrives and the car does indeed look different to what we saw in testing. No longer able to hide behind fakery anymore, or something that isn't the full picture, because, well, you got to drive the nuts off it in time for Q1. You got to drive it in anger. So if the car is genuinely more stable than Aston's ground effect concepts were, Alonso becomes terrifying because he'll roar out of the gate immediately and he'll pull the team along with him. I'm not saying that Lance is completely written off here or as a lost cause or anything, because he could easily work with this environment as long as he feels that the process and the team around him are working on his behalf legitimately instead of it being some kind of obligation. That is the best case scenario, but if the car is still not fully baked and there are still some problems to fix, there is a scenario where Alonso could still get something out of the car. I don't think he'll be absolutely terrible, but that might be a scenario where Lance ends up floundering because it's simply not fully developed or conceived to make it completely drivable for all sorts of drivers. Fernando has plenty of experience to lean on, and a couple of years of cars of Aston Martin ilk that weren't exactly optimal, whereas Lance, as we've seen, falls down in qualifying, and more often than not, falls out of Q1. In fact, the driver with the most amount of Q1 exits in the entire history of Formula 1. He'll end up being the fall guy, and as we have seen, F1 fans will organically gravitate towards making him the fall guy and deciding his fate. So what Aston Martin's doing here and trying to build up some kind of cult of personality around Adrian, even though I don't think he's a willing participant, it's not exactly a perfect plan. It could be really good in the fullness of time, but right now, it's a bit of a risky gamble, especially when it comes to their drivers, because if it does work out, then Fernando's ceiling will be raised, whereas Lance's floor will be lowered. And that weirdly may be by design, because if there's anything that we've seen from various regulation cycle changes over the years, is that the driver at a team that can harness it and then tap into it the fastest becomes the lead developer. And this applies to every single team. I'm not saying Aston Martin's a special case. You'll look to one driver who's handling it better than the other one, and then the team will be thinking, yes, that person is the guy we want to be getting the most feedback from. They'll become the center of attention. So we could easily see a situation where Fernando becomes, once again, the center of attention for the fact that he's managed to grasp these regulations and these rules and these cars faster than Lance can. Exactly what we saw in 2023. He arrives, the AMR26 is right there, which was mostly developed by Vettel. He plonks himself in there, boom, he gets a podium. He immediately got some kudos, whereas Lance, well, that year wasn't great, with that crash out in Qatar being an example. So where does this leave us fans then regarding Aston Martin's place? Well, I would like you to look at what the team does in the next few weeks and think about two things. First, as I pointed out, compare the car that we see around the Australian Grand Prix weekend to what we saw at the shakedown and what we saw at the test. The second will be what the team's language is regarding drivability once the race weekend starts properly. Adrian is the team principal now, and while he considers it merely a title, it does carry some natural heft, so the way the team manages to narrate itself will come from the mind of Newey, and drivability will be at the centre of it, which is exactly what he said in his interview. Drivability is key. And that is something that Ford's Mark Rushbrook has said regarding their development of the power unit for Red Bull in their bid to keep Max happy and think of the rest of the drivers. We could see this car being an absolute rocket ship, a term that many drivers like to rely upon. It might be an absolutely sensitive beast, which is incredibly skittish, that only the experience of Fernando Alonso might be able to tame. But then again, his age might be a bit of an issue. We don't know. But one thing is for sure, Lance has to hit the ground running to try and stave off the fans that are just waiting for an excuse to say, hey, Aston, come on. I know what you're trying to do here, but Lance ain't it. And it might be that pressure alone that sees his exit absolutely happen. Because drivability is what Adrian is going for. He wants to make this car drivable. And if Lance can't drive a car which is intended to be drivable, then where is he? He has initially said that he felt good with the car. He might feel okay with the overall design, but if he's not really hyped up about the fact that he's getting to work with Adrian Newey, an engineer that many drivers would sell their soul to work with and drive one of their cars, then it might tell you a lot about where Lance's state of mind is right now. Because he'll have a car that is actually properly built for him, for Fernando, for the team. They're not borrowing another team's concept, the green Red Bull, the pink Mercedes. Even though, admittedly, there are some people saying that Enrico Cardile's influence is turning this into the green Ferrari in a way, that is not fully founded. Because again, what we saw in Barcelona may not be the final article in Australia, so we can't really make that assumption yet either. But I just still find it really fascinating that Aston are just hyping up this man to their hilt, way more than any other team that he's worked for. But when you actually look at the interview, Newey is just talking like someone who does not want to be the Messiah. He is not Jesus. He is more like Brian. He's speaking like an engineer who knows that this regulation cycle can be messy, but also really, really good to tap into. Certainly a little bit more enjoyable than the previous regulations, and even the title suggests that too. But then the optics, the website itself, does not look like a modest interpretation or design. By design, it looks large and in charge. So with that in mind, Adrian is trying to design a car and develop it and decide when the world will be allowed to understand it properly. And then the team itself, its branding department, saying by design, that's the wrapper that makes the delay feel like purpose. That is kind of clever, admittedly, but a little bit, over the top. And it might also create the most fascinating driver storyline of the flyaway phase, because it may turn the garage into a stage where one man thrives under myth and another man has to prove he deserves to be in the myth at all. And as every modern Formula 1 fan knows, the sport absolutely loves a little bit of soap opera. And a video that you might love as well is this video right here. And if you want to tell everyone that it's still just testing, bro, well, look down there and get it while you can.